Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Yuan campus in Hong Kong. We're sharing tonight's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the UChicago Yuan campus here in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the question and answer button by first registering on Zoom. And I also encourage you to visit the UChicago Yuan campus website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to the e-news for the latest programs and information that are taking place on campus. We'll wrap up tonight's program with a poll and more information about upcoming events, so be sure to stay tuned until the very end. Tonight we'll be talking about a recent hot topic, ChatGPT, and we'll learn what university faculty and a banking professional think about the future of ChatGPT in the accounting, finance, and investment sector. Let's start tonight with a brief introduction of our speakers. Mark McDonald is Head of Data Science and Analytics for HSBC Global Research. Mark's the lead author of HSBC's flagship quant publication, Data Matters, and is responsible for HSBC's proprietary risk-on, risk-off analysis, surprise indices, and the Little Mac FX valuations. Mark also advises investors on building systematic models and applying machine learning techniques to financial markets. Before joining HSBC in 2006, Mark obtained a DPhil in applied mathematics from the University of Oxford. His doctoral research investigating the dynamics of correlation networks in FX markets was sponsored by HSBC FX strategy team. David Hagmann is an assistant professor in the Department of Management at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His research examines how people's complex relationship with information leads to decisions that deviate from the standard economic accounts. David's research shows that people value their beliefs and thus actively avoid information, even when the information could help them make better decisions. David also conducts research in the area of behavioral public policy. His work shows that nudges, small changes to the environment that don't affect economic incentives, can crowd out support for more heavy-handed but also more effective policies. David's recent work looks at how errors in statistical reasoning can create false beliefs about differences between genders and ethnicities, leading to discrimination against minority groups. David received a BA in mathematics and economics from Fordham University and his MS and PhD in behavioral decision research from Carnegie Mellon University. And prior to joining HKUST, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Maximilian Muhn is an assistant professor of accounting at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. Maxi, as we like to call him, and he likes to be called, is broadly interested in empirical accounting research. His current work focuses on the determinants of consequences of a firm's financial transparency, as well as the effects of financial market and transparency regulation. Muhn joined Chicago Booth as an assistant professor of accounting in 2019, and he earned a PhD in accounting from Humboldt University of Berlin and holds MSc and a BSc in business administration from the University of Münster, Germany. During his studies, he gained work experience in consulting at McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group, auditing experience at KPMG and Deloitte, and management accounting at BASF and ThyssenKrupp Steel. Maxi wants to enable his students to speak the language of accounting and to understand its economic foundations. He really enjoys, outside of academia, he enjoys traveling, reading, podcasts, basketball, and ultimate Frisbee. Thanks for you all for joining us tonight. Mark, I'll hand the stage over to you so that you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hopefully you can all hear me. Let me just. So, hello everybody. Today we're talking about the impact of ChatGPT on the investment process. Of course, by ChatGPT, we're really using that as shorthand for the broader technology of generative AI. Because there are very few things you can confidently forecast, but there's intensely fast progress in this area. So somebody's going to make a better model than ChatGPT soon, and then that will be the focus. but the idea of ChatGPT being an important enabling general purpose technology will continue. And there's obviously been immense excitement about these technologies. And to illustrate the degree of hype that this is now getting, this chart shows the frequency with which company management have used specific terms on earnings calls over the years. And most of these terms here, these are generative AI terms, so they only appear at the end because this is a recent obsession. For context, the grey bars show the frequency with which company management have discussed robotics. Now, robotics is a mature technology that has direct implications for the operations of many businesses. And yet so far this year, company management have not just spoken about the topic generative AI, but just the exact phrase generative AI has been used more frequently than discussion of robotics. I think that illustrates the intensity of the hype. And so I think one of the most immediate ways that ChatGPT is going to have an impact on decision making in the investment process is when markets tend to get obsessed about a disruptive technology, they have a tendency to get too excited. And generally, the excitement falls into one of three categories. It's either pricing in the impact too early, it could be pricing in too big an impact, or it could be pricing in an impact too broadly, where technology will have a concentrated effect where a small number of winners reap most of the benefits, and yet people price in the benefits across an entire sector. And so I think that's going to be the first way that investors are going to have to deal with the impact of generative AI, is trying to work out what's priced in and is that appropriate. So I think one thing that would be helpful would be to talk a little bit about how these models actually work. When you talk with ChatGPT and you go and have a chat with it, how is it able to have a conversation with a human and appear so intelligent and well-informed? Well, ChatGPT and other similar models, these are really a type of machine learning model known as language modeling. And what's going on there is the input to your machine learning model, you give it a sequence of words, and you ask it to predict what comes next. And the great thing about this is there's almost unlimited training data. Because all you have to do is go and get some text, and scrape everything on the internet, and start deleting words. So as an example, if I were to start a sentence, as a data scientist, I am good at, if I were to end that sentence with something like the word statistics, then that's a fairly normal sentence. And those of you that are half listening while you're checking your emails or doing something else, that wouldn't snap you out of your reverie. However, if I were to end that sentence and say, as a data scientist, I am good at cage fighting, now that is a weird sentence. That's going to make you go, hang on, come again? What did he say? It's clearly ridiculous, and you know that it's ridiculous because you understand how the world works and what is typical behavior and typical relationships. And for a machine learning model to be able to plausibly continue any sentence on any topic means that it has to encode an awful lot of information about how the world typically works. And this is why these models are able to appear so well informed and so intelligent, because they've been able to encode that knowledge. But I think that highlights two of the big challenges with using these models at the moment. So one is that these models, they're just trying to generate plausible sequence of words. And so you can ask a generative AI model a question, and it can give you a confident sounding answer that might be entirely made up. And so there's a lot of research in the tech industry at the moment for how do we constrain the output of these models so that they stick more closely to an established knowledge base of facts. And the other issue with how these models have been trained is they've been trained with everything on the internet. And this is great because it means it's seen all the classic works of literature from all cultures. It's seen vast amounts of technical information on basically any topic. It's seen lots and lots of commentary about news and current affairs. But it's also seen all of Reddit and probably 4chan as well, and less salubrious forms of communication. And there is a big risk that these models, as well as encoding all the knowledge that you would like, they end up encoding all sorts of biases and prejudices that you would not like them to encode. And there's the risk that they end up perpetuating and exacerbating already existing biases. So how are people using technology like this? Well, for a long time, although the recent obsession is generative AI, for a long time, for many years now, the standard practice in natural language processing has been to train these language models and then basically throw them away, which sounds bizarre. But what we would do is you would train a language model where you've got lots and lots of data, where you can get it to predict upcoming words in a sentence. And then what you do is you chop off the final layer, that layer that predicts the next word, and you stitch on another layer that does something else that you're more interested in. And a very common example is training a model at sentiment analysis to work out whether a piece of text is positive or negative or neutral. And the benefit of doing this is that by keeping the rest of the model apart from the final layer that you've chopped off, you get for free in your sentiment model all that knowledge that the language model has baked in about how language is typically used. And it means with a much smaller amount of training data, you're able to build a very powerful model for sentiment analysis or any other more standard natural language processing task. And so here's an example of type of analysis that we do. We've trained our own sentiment model that identifies sentiment at the level of individual sentences. And this allows us to measure targeted sentiment. So the sentiment when companies are talking about specific themes. In this chart here, we're showing how positively or negatively are companies talking when they speak about the future. And this is a very flexible technique. And so I think a pretty direct way that these powerful language models will end up being used in the investment process is simply by making existing workflows more powerful. You get a better model, you're more able to use these techniques. Now, ChatGPT gets the majority of the news coverage, and the ability to chat with these models is very striking. But there are a whole host of other generative models for other types of content. So I think the most striking are these image generation models. So here's an example. You give the model some text of what you'd like to see, and it draws a picture for you. In this case, I asked for a picture of a cute meerkat wearing a gi, performing martial arts. I've got to say, it nailed this one. It's exactly what I wanted to see. But it's not just models like these. These are obviously the most impressive because humans are very visual creatures. But there are models for all sorts of content. There are models that will generate code for you. There are models that you give it video and it will generate appropriate audio. And increasingly, the path seems to be for models to be what's called multimodal, where they truly understand the relationships between text and image and audio and video, and can generate in any of those and understand inputs in any of those forms. And I think this leads to another fairly easy way that these technologies are likely to help out in the investment process. Very few people have the luxury of being able to sit there, come up with an investment thesis, and then just immediately implement it themselves. In the institutional investment setting, almost everybody has somebody that they have to explain themselves to and convince, whether that's your boss, whether that's your risk department, whether it's a compliance department, whether it's a regulator, whether it's the end investors that ultimately invest in your fund and give you capital. There is some work that needs to be done where you need to take your brilliant idea and convince other people. And as part of that process, inevitably, that requires producing content. You need to write research reports, you need to write emails, you need to put together PowerPoint slide decks. And just because you're excellent at coming up with investment ideas doesn't mean you're going to be excellent at that. And so there's all this quite time-consuming work that needs to be done that is ancillary to the core role that you're performing. And I think these generative models have the ability to be a huge productivity improvement there. where these models are great, so you give a very rough sketch of what you would like to see, and then they make a professionalized version of that. And so in this example on screen here, I work in financial markets. We're not known for being shy about our own abilities, but even I can't pretend that my sketch on the left is better than the AI generated image on the right. And I think this it's been likened to autocomplete on steroids. I think this is a fairly direct way in which generative AI will end up having a big impact on the investment process. With that, I will hand over to David.
Thank you so much for this and for inviting me to be part of this. This is, a very timely topic, and it's been super fun to put together. So what I want to talk about is a bit about the risks of using ChatGPT as an investment tool, but also what I think are opportunities. And you'll see that I generated a lot of these images as well using a different AI mid-journey. And the first question people usually ask me is, does AI make you more productive? And my response usually is, well, not really. I spend a lot of time now playing with these tools, trying to create just a little bit different graphics, when before that I would have just plugged in something and been happy with it. So I hope the output is a bit better. Okay, but what I want to talk of first is one of the risks, which Mark has already mentioned earlier. It's this idea of bias in AI. And AI researchers call this AI safety. If you're not part of this field, you might think this is, robots or AI taking over the world. But actually, it's all the kind of things that you want to think about when you want to make a tool like ChatGPT generally safe for the public to use. So maybe building in safeguards so people cannot use it to scam, right? You can have an automated agent and a ChatGPT agent call you, impersonate a close relative's voice, and then try and scam you out of money. So these are the kind of tools. And so I was playing around a few weeks ago with ChatGPT, and I thought, let's see what this is doing, right? Let's think about something like AI bias. And so I said, well, imagine, there's a man and a woman who come to a bank. They want some financial advice. How should they split their investments between stocks and bonds? And then ChatGPT refuses to answer the question, right? It says, based on this information, you cannot just infer people's risk preferences. You can't do this based on gender. And then it took a little bit more prodding. In fact, it just took one more message. And let's just come up with 2 portfolios. This is all you know about these 2 people, and give me something, right? It starts off with a little bit of a caveat, and then look what it tells me. It tells me it's a higher risk portfolio, 70% stocks for the men. The woman should get a lower risk portfolio with 40% stocks. And this is well documented, right? This is gender bias in AI or in ChatGPT's advice. You can see this across all kinds of things. You ask the tool to write a letter of recommendation for someone. It writes differently if the person's name is John versus if the person's name is Jane. So this is well documented. And this is generally something that people are concerned about. But I think from an investment perspective, I wouldn't be super concerned about this. What I really would be concerned about is this part here, right? Initially, I asked it this question, and it refused to answer the question. And so what I want to know is, why did it refuse, right? Where did this come from? So it's not that ChatGPT has been crawling the web and learning information and then decided that it should not give this kind of advice. It's very happy to give the advice. This is not coming from the training data, right? What happened here is that someone hard-coded a limitation into ChatGPT. They gave it some instructions that said, if you get this kind of request, don't answer it, right? Refuse to, or filter through it. And so the question I immediately have is, what other instructions does ChatGPT have that it's not so open about, right? This is not an open source tool. So if you're using this for investment decisions, you really want to know what other kind of consideration it's taking into account that it's not so transparently disclosing like this one. Now, I don't think it's doing this, but just imagine you ask it, should I invest in Microsoft? How unbiased is that advice going to be, given that Microsoft has a very large stake in OpenAI? And as an investor, you don't know this because you don't have access to this tool. So that's the first thing I'd be concerned about. The second thing is that we talk about ChatGPT, and of course, we can also talk about these large language models more broadly. But what's really interesting is the extensions that get built on top of this. And I have to label it as like knowing what we don't know, right? Because for many of us who are not in the AI field, but who are sort of trying to make use of this technology, ChatGPT is pretty new and cool. But people who are in this field are already building on top of this. And that has implications for the investments we would make. So here are just some examples. One is Code Interpreter, which is actually done by OpenAI itself. So this is a testing feature by the company making ChatGPT. And it's not one of the plugins you may have access to already. But it's a tool that can take a data set, write its own code, execute the code, and generate an analysis as a result. And the reason I mention this as a potential risk is because if we're the general public and we're using ChatGPT, we're way behind the curve, right? This is a much more advanced feature that we simply don't have access to. As another tool called AutoGPT, and basically what it does is it builds on top of ChatGPT, but also gives it web access and data storage. So now you can tell ChatGPT, find this information. It connects to another agent that does a web search, brings the results back into ChatGPT and analyzes it. And what you can do is you can give it specific objectives, and it autonomously chains together different commands and writes code. It can go scrape a website and take the data, analyze it, and give you results by chaining together different tools. And lastly, which is more interesting for the academic side of things, but there's now a tool called Data to Paper, which basically gives multiple ChatGPT instances. So it spins up multiple different agents, and it assigns them different roles, like write a literature review, describe a data set, analyze data, write a paper. And then it gets another version of ChatGPT with web access to do fact checking, right? So there's a lot of, how do I know if ChatGPT doesn't make up data? Well, we have another AI with web access that does the fact checking. And so it actually revises its paper based on another reviewer. And the people who have done this, they said they went out to lunch and they came back with 5 academic papers. That's purely correlational in data, right? But it's doing this very quickly. And I mentioned these because these are the 3 big examples that we actually know about. But presumably there are many, many more we don't know about, right? If you're a hedge fund trading with one of these tools, you're not going to go on Twitter and tell us all about it. You're going to use it internally. And if you're curious about reading this paper, this is the one that is completely written by artificial intelligence, including the hypothesis generation, the data analysis, and so on. Okay, now how does ChatGPT get trained? Of course, Mark already mentioned this. It's really absorbing vast quantities of information. And not just websites, but newspaper articles, books, videos, images, and even code repositories like GitHub. And so that's how it knows how to code, right? It has access to all this code from programmers. But that is all public information, right? Now, if you really want to be successful at investing, it really helps to have some private information. So think about this, especially a few years ago when this was less widely available. You can use satellites to track oil reserves. So you can track trucks going in and out of Walmart distribution centers, and that lets you predict either oil supply, or it lets you predict consumer demand in the US. But it's not the kind of information you're just going to get from the web. That's the kind of private information that helps you get a boost. Now, as regular investors, we don't have access to that. But imagine really like Bloomberg, right? You have all this information private to you. That's actually very useful. Now you can customize ChatGPT, right? You don't just have to take the version that's online free to use or with a small subscription, but you can actually spend millions of dollars to fine-tune it based on your private data. And then that's much more likely to give you actionable information that the rest of the market doesn't already have. And I would just assume that, it costs a few $1 million. It's going to get cheaper over time. And I wouldn't be surprised if some big traders, institutional traders, are already doing a version of this, right? Okay, as we also have public data, public data may start to get polluted. So at first glance, this just looks like an Amazon review, 5 stars by a very happy consumer. But then when you read very closely, you see this area that I'm bracketing here. It turns out this was a review written by ChatGPT. And so now if you're scraping Amazon reviews, what you're actually going to scrape is a lot of likely, ChatGPT generated information in order to train your model. And there's actually some research that this can pollute the data set very badly. So a big risk is going to be the integrity of publicly available data. Now, lastly, I want to talk about one opportunity, which is going to be dealing with complexity. So let's take one example. These are ESG ratings from Morningstar. ESG, of course, is environmental, social, good governance. It's the kind of ratings, right, for the company that isn't just profitable, but also does good by its employees and by the world. So the way we do this generally is we have some numeric score. So here's Tesla, for example. Their ESG risk rating is 3 out of 5, would look like very nice planets there. So not bad. Meta, the company behind Facebook, they have 2 out of 5 planets. And the Swiss bank UBS has 4 out of 5 planets. So now if you're trying to think, what does this mean, right? Does this mean UBS is better for the environment than the company that makes electric cars? Well, ESG is not just environment. How do I take this, how do I make investments based on this rating? It's kind of very granular. It's very, very coarse. So there's not just Morningstar doing these ratings. This is from MSCI. They also have an ESG score, and they tell you what goes into this measure. And there's over 30 factors. You don't have to look at all of them, right? But you have climate change. It's consisting of carbon emissions, the product carbon footprint, and so on. And so basically what they do is they evaluate companies based on all these 30 plus factors. They generate some numeric scores for each of these evaluations. And then they combine all those numeric scores into a single score, their ESG score. It's actually a letter rating. And then you can use that as an investor. So you can maybe say, I'm going to invest in an A company, but not in a B company, for example. Well, that's how we as people can make decisions, right? We cannot take all these factors individually and come up with something sensible, but ChatGPT and large language models don't have this restriction. In fact, maybe LLMs, the large language models, we could say they love learning more. There's no need to reduce the dimensionality of the data. You don't need to have a single ESG score, just have all the 30 ratings. In fact, you don't even need to have a numeric score for all of this, right? You can input unstructured data. It can learn from spreadsheets, images, websites, social media. It doesn't need to be condensed to a numeric score. What it can also do is it can connect widely different sources of data. So for us, right, we would like to know like a numeric score for an ESG rating, but ChatGPT could, for example, scan an annual report and look at the environmental commitments that these companies make, and then also look at news coverage. Like, is this company involved in environmental disasters or scandals? And why not connect both of these data sets? You can even think of something like, a company that you scrape their LinkedIn data. Let's look at who works at this company, right? Let's download all the photos. Let's look at the annual reports of their commitments to diversity, see how well that matches up with who they hire. And then maybe also go look for lawsuits that allege discrimination in employment law. And so see, how does this company actually deal with diversity rather than just what they tell us and what kind of pictures they put on their website. The caveat here is that all of this would require some advanced features, including access to real-time news. And so it's unlikely to be doable with ChatGPT on its own. But I think having the capacity to build on top of this is where the real leverage is going to be. And so this is Midjourney's visualization of connecting multiple AI. But that, I think, is where I think the biggest opportunity is. So why just have one tool like ChatGPT? Why not have many different AIs, combining information from different sources that is generally very complex, but then actually condense it to actionable advice for investors? And with that, let me hand it over to Maxi.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Actually, the paper I want to present now, so this is joint work with Alex, and who's a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and Valerie, who is a senior professor in accounting. It's pretty much related to what David just said at the very end. It's essentially to what extent ChatGPT is useful in reducing complexity in digesting financial statement information. And this is one working paper that we have been working on the last few months and that we just released on SSRN, but we have a couple of other ideas related to similar topics, what we could be doing. So as a starting point, besides our joint excitement about ChatGPT, we are using it heavily also not only for research purposes, but for other purposes as well, is also that there is evidence in the literature that essentially textual data, for example, what companies are writing in their financial reports, but also what newspapers are writing about companies and so on, has become basically everywhere. And in order to beat the market, at least trying to beat the market to generate some alpha, you probably have to incorporate this into your investment strategy. There's also a recent Journal of Finance article that argues that since this textual data has grown so much, for example, financial reports have become longer and longer in the US over time, it's basically very hard for the market to digest this information in a timely basis. And this was actually the starting point for the process, for this project, because we wanted to see to what extent is ChatGPT actually useful in processing this information, essentially reducing the complexity of digesting this information. So what we did in this project was essentially we wanted to address 4 research questions. So first, to what extent is ChatGPT useful in extracting the most relevant information from corporate disclosures? So is it really capable of focusing on the most important parts, or does it also include all the boilerplate stuff and so on? Then how do these summaries look like? Because one key advantage actually of ChatGPT is due to their large training database and that it was partially trained on summarization. It's somewhat likely that these summaries contain high quality information, but we basically want to see what's different between the original document and the summarized document. Then we basically shift around the perspective and ask us, okay, we now have the summaries, we have the original document. So what was essentially the information that was left out by ChatGPT? Is this, for example, the attempt in conference calls, for example, from managers to obfuscate bad information, for example, that they try to hide it by hiding it behind a lot of boilerplate, and it's essentially the information that ChatGPT is left out, also a useful piece of information in terms of understanding, for example, information asymmetries. Then the last question also directly goes back to what David essentially said, is we also started to probe the value of this AI to extract certain types of targeted summaries. For example, we started with ESG information, environmental information, financial information, risk information, and so on, because I think this is really a fruitful way how investors in the future could use this information, basically a very quick way to directly get at, for example, the core initiatives of a company and so on. So what we did in this project here, and it also shows that this is a really evolving field, is so we used GPT 3.5, which was released, the API was released in mid-March. It still had some restrictions in terms of the tokens that you could feed in. So we had to use an algorithm to basically chunk up these relatively lengthy documents into multiple chunks and then process them and then concate them back together. However, with GPT-4, the API will probably be released soon. Also, all these limits will be gone. So it's a little bit more simple over time to use these tools going forwards. What we used is a so-called zero-shot summarization approach. So unlike other machine learning models, we didn't train the model or anything like this. We really just gave it a prompt. Please summarize the following document, which is contains information from corporate disclosures, for example. Then also, since the API slows down quite a bit, we also in the current version sampled 20% of all firms because it took quite some time to process all these financial documents. So the first question was, how effective are these summaries? And as a first finding here, and these unfortunately these are taken directly from the paper, but what we find here is that if the original length is about 18,000 words, the summarized document goes down to about 4,000 words for the MD&A section, which is essentially the discussion of the management in an annual report that is required in the US. And this essentially means that it cuts down the length of the document about 70%. It also gets a little bit harder to read. So this is indicated by the FOC index, which somewhat makes sense. If you condense a lot of information into a shorter piece, it probably needs to be a little bit more complex. We also focus on conference calls, so conference call transcripts where managers directly discuss like the performance of the last quarter. And we find a similar reduction in the length of these conference calls. So it cuts down the conference calls also about 70%. In Interestingly, we also find that the underlying information seems to be amplified. And one way to gauge this is what Mark mentioned at the beginning, we look at sentiment of the underlying documents. So to what extent these documents try to convey a positive or a negative spin, so to say. And we see that relative to the original document, for example, the sentiment of the conference roll is here 0.0246, which is a positive number. It gets even more positive within the summary. On the other hand, if we look at negative documents, in this case it's not significant, but with subsample as is, for example, for MD&As, the MD&As are generally more negative because they contain a lot of legal boilerplate language that you have to be cautious in using this information, essentially to guard the management from litigation. They also become relatively more negative. So this is one first finding that we had, that it seems to amplify the underlying information content. The first result that we really got excited about is then when we try to use this summarized information in order to explain short-term stock returns. Here we focus on the MD&A sample. So this is the information that the management discusses in the annual report about the risks, about the opportunities and so on of the firm. And if you just use a simple sentiment measure for the raw document, so the unsummarized version, you basically find no significant correlation of this sentiment measure with short-term abnormal returns. On the other hand, if you use also this relatively simple sentiment measure on the summarized version of the document, you find relatively strong correlations with abnormal returns, which suggests that essentially the summarized document much better reflects information about the performance of the firm. And you can see this both from the statistical significance here, but also, for example, looking at the increase in the adjusted R-square. Then we shift the perspective. So we now looked at the summarized document, how well it explains stock returns and so on. And now we ask the question, okay, why are some summaries shorter? Why are other summaries longer? And what could be plausible reasons here? And so we run a simple determinant model and look at disclosure plot. So to what extent essentially information that was in the original document is thrown out by ChatGPT. And we find several correlations that are consistent with prior literature. For example, we find that if the firm had a relatively bad performance, for example, a low ROA, or had a relatively negative language in the document, and so on, or here in the conference calls had a loss, there tends to be more plot in these disclosures. So there seems to be much more less relevant information. And this could be due to, for example, a manager trying to obfuscate the bad performance, try to hide it behind something else. Or it could be also the case, the Anna Karenina principle, that's much more difficult to explain bad performance relative to positive performance. And then ChatGPT essentially boils down this information more directly in a better summary measure. We also find that this disclosure plot is significantly correlated with information asymmetry measures. So for example, if you look at the bid-ask spreads or abnormal spreads after the event, we find that if a management releases a document that contains more plot, that this is significantly correlated with information asymmetries, which suggests that some investors are not able to process this information efficiently, whereas probably the more the hedge funds and so on are probably capable of digesting this information, and therefore there is this disagreement between these two types of investors. Finally, and this is one thing that we're currently actively working on, I think one fruitful avenue is also to see the usefulness of ChatGPT to easily get standardized information in terms of what firms are doing in terms of certain initiatives. So in the first step, and we have now more in our more recent version of the paper, is that we just measure to what extent they discuss ESG overall. And this is done just by a simple prompt, like summarize the information on environment, social and governance and initiatives in the conference calls in this case, or the financial performance here. And interestingly, you can see this increasing trend in ESG information over time in conference calls. So especially in the last 2 years of our sample, the ESG information that was discussed goes up by quite a bit, whereas, of course, financial information always was relatively steady in these conference calls. Also, interestingly, consistent with some recent finance papers, also the significance of the discussion of ESG information. So if you use a sentiment measure of ESG, also becomes more significant in terms of explaining short-term returns. So this suggests that essentially this information that is extracted on ESG by by ChatGPT actually useful to explain stock market returns in the more recent years. Okay, so that's basically it. So this is also this is essentially one showcase how ChatGPT could be used to reduce complexity, in process information efficiently, and then also perhaps help investment decisions. So thanks a lot. I think I'm back to Mark now for the panel discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Maxi. That's really great. Thank you for all your presentations today. Maxi, one of the audience members just wanted a clarification on what MD&A means. I think I might know what it means, but I don't want to take a shot at it. You better answer that one.
Yeah, apologies. So this is the management discussion and analysis section in an annual report. So this is basically the part of the annual report that it's not directly about like the balance sheet, the income statement or anything like this, but this is like a verbal description by the management that tries to discuss essentially how the management sees their business, what are the key risks. And this is shown from prior literature. This is essentially a core part. Yeah, what help investors digest what's going on with the firm beyond the balance sheet, beyond the other financial statements like the income statement. So yeah, you can think about it like a verbal description of, like, for example, Netflix would discuss, for example, if a new streamer enters the market, that what they think will happen over the next year. So it's a little bit more forward-looking than other financial statement information.
Thanks for the explanation there, Maxi. Let me start with you, Mark, real quick. I guess I'm curious how challenged you are with this technology in the banking world, and how many regulations or approvals are needed for you to pursue certain avenues, and how are you guided in your work? Do departments come to you and ask you to apply AI to help them make better decisions? How does it work within a bank?
Yeah, it's interesting because we wrote a big report about generative AI, and we went to all the equity analysts who cover specific sectors to see how do you see this technology influencing your sector. And obviously, some of them are obvious, like media. It produces content much more cheaply. Tech, semiconductors, clear influences there. Some sectors much less obvious, but our analysts saw a significant impact there. One of the ones where our analysts were sort of most wary about seeing a significant influence in the near term was actually in the finance sector, and part of that is because it's so heavily regulated. So the last thing you want is your retail banking chatbots being creative, and these models, what they're really good at is creativity. You don't want people going and asking it a factual question about whether they're overdrawn or not, and the language model just making it up. And so we do see that basically. I think it's much easier to see use cases in the near term where these are internal productivity improvements. Than the bar there is much lower than being able to directly interface with customers. So something we see in the research, investment research area, is what you can't have is a customer use a chatbot that answers questions about our research, and they say, "What's your view on XYZ?" and it tells you a view that's not our view. That would be a big problem. So even a use case like research, which is published, it's public information, it's not even private information. Even there are regulations around having this be the interface between us and our customers that are much less of a concern for other sectors of the economy. So there are many experiments going on, not just in our department, across the whole bank, of people trying out different use cases of these technologies. I think most of them are likely to be internal for a while for that reason.
Great, thanks. I'm going to turn to David and Maxi to try to answer this question, because we had a number of questions about AI and ChatGPT replacing humans, whether on the stock trading floor or in the back office. And I probably don't want to ask Mark those questions. It'd be more appropriate for David and Maxi to answer those questions. David, why don't you take a crack at that one?
Sure, I'll take them on financial advisors in terms of replacing them. And I think AI will not, because if you think about what you want from a financial advisor, part of it is you want some help about asset allocation, some help about tax optimization, all these actual technical things. But then I think a big part of what a financial advisor does is they convey trust, right? They talk you down when you're trying to sell your stocks in the middle of a crash. They're like, sleep on it, or and I don't think people would trust AI to do this. I don't think AI could take this role. And so that's where I think the role for financial advisors is going to be. It's much less on the optimization side. Maybe there they can use an AI tool, but then they can really focus on actually maintaining and building client relations.
Well, first of all, I think OpenAI themselves, they released a research paper in November where they actually did a pretty cool thing. They looked at all the different jobs that's out there. They used this taxonomy, I think, which links jobs to tasks. And they themselves modeled what they think which task will be able to be replaced by OpenAI. And they actually created a hit list of the jobs that are most endangered there. So if someone wants to take a look at it, it's a public paper out there. I mean, my personal opinion is I think it will change a lot of different professions, including, for example, the accounting profession. But it's mostly, as also Mark mentioned, I think mostly the internal side there, that, for example, you can make some processes more efficient, creating pictures more efficient, but perhaps even processing information, summarization, and so on and so on. I'm not entirely sure whether it will ever replace one-to-one some analysts in the financial world or accountants or CPAs in the accounting world. I think it will probably reduce a little bit of the work that's needed in the back office. I think there's also a Wall Street Journal article about it where they talked about that it will replace, how they called it, the grunt work that's needed. So instead of you having like maybe a couple of interns there, maybe you can now automate it a little bit more. So I think it will have a very profound impact how we do our jobs, probably even as professors or researchers as well, but I don't think it will replace it.
Well, I'm going to come back to you on that point, Maxi, but let me ask Mark. So HSBC, huge enterprise, obviously, with a major footprint in Hong Kong, China. You're sitting in London. There is limited access to ChatGPT here in Hong Kong. How do you reconcile that as an organization? Is all the work being done in AI with ChatGPT outside of Hong Kong and China, or do your Hong Kong, China teams get involved in some of that activity?
So well, it's actually not possible for anyone to go direct to OpenAI. So the big risk, one of the big risks in banks is information control. Because this technology is so useful, then there is inevitably a risk that if you gave people access to these tools, because they're so useful, they'll inadvertently put confidential data into the OpenAI system. And so all the experiments that we're doing, and when I speak to our clients as well about things that they're trying, most people seem to be going down the route of either trying to use some of the open source models from Hugging Face, or if they want to use the ChatGPT models, then they're using them via the link with Microsoft. So with Microsoft, you can use them on the Azure platform. So they will give access to the models, but then you can have them on your own Azure tenant. So you never have to send the information out of the institution. And so I think that seems to be a fairly common workflow, because they are so useful, these things, that the temptation, if you gave everybody access to them, the temptation for somebody to inadvertently put something on there, send something there for summarization that they really shouldn't have done, is quite large.
Well, that's a really good point. And my next question was for David and Maxi. I've heard about universities here in Hong Kong prohibiting their students from using ChatGPT in the classroom. David, what are you doing at UST? Maxi, how are you using it? David, why don't you go first?
So at UST, we encourage students to use it. I think we're maybe the only university that really, tells students go use it, tells faculty don't restrict the use, or if you do, to the minimum possible. So I tell all my students to use it, and what I tell them is that the minimum standard for passable has just gone up by a lot, right? If I put something into ChatGPT, that output is no longer a passing grade. So they need to do better, right? And I think when we were little, right, you might have gotten some points for nice spelling, and grammatical errors were forgivable. And now that we all have Word, typing should be fine. We want some grammar check, we want spell check, and so I think the expectations are just going to go up.
Yeah, so I'm only teaching in the spring quarter, so I still have a little bit way to go, but I've been thinking about this actually a lot because I tested it myself using it for a couple of my case studies. And yeah, as David mentioned, the answers that you get out there, at least to the less technical questions, are actually pretty good. Internally, I think there's not a hard set rule how we should go about it. There's an internal working group, I think, who is discussing what we can do in teaching. I know anecdotally from other professors, some is essentially I'm praising it a little bit like David does, sometimes even telling students they should first use ChatGPT and then comment on the answer. But of course, that is also difficult that you don't ask ChatGPT to comment on the answer. I personally, I have to think still about it, how I can incorporate it into my, especially in the case study work there, because I think it could be useful, but of course it also then changes a little bit the way we need to, how to assess performance. And that's the one thing I'm thinking about quite a bit, yeah.
Great. I know we talked about elimination of jobs due to AI, but what about the opportunities, Mark, and the other panelists here? What do you see as the opportunities? Where are you hiring? Are you hiring data scientists? Are you hiring product managers who can manage building apps on top of AI? What are you seeing, Mark?
I think this is this is often a common worry with any technology. When you get a new technology that enables something to be done much quicker and much cheaper than it used to be done, there's a natural human tendency to focus on what is being taken away. But often we find that these technologies, they create as many, if not more, jobs than end up being taken away by the technology. It just kind of shifts the skill set that's being employed. And so, something that we've seen in the financial markets is, when I joined the industry, which is a while ago, admittedly, but there were many more human execution traders, people manually executing trades. And over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, an increasing proportion of that has been done by machines. So there are fewer humans doing that, even though the volume of trading has gone up massively. But there are now an army of quants and database administrators and developers and system admins responsible for looking after these machines. And there's probably a much larger workforce doing that work than there ever was when you had humans doing it. So I think there are indeed, like, data science is a very hot topic. There's a huge demand, huge competition for people with the right skills in that area. But I think also, because as this technology becomes more widely available, and it is a general purpose technology that lots of people can use in lots of different ways. And I think the main thing is for institutions to train and upskill their workforce so that they have the flexibility to see the opportunities that this technology brings, rather than worry too much about, okay, it's taking away these aspects of my job, but there are now all these opportunities that have come from this technology.
David and Maxi, are you seeing opportunities, and do you see your universities respectively investing in educating more students in this area?
I'm not sure whether there's a directly targeted initiative. There's definitely working groups discussing these things. I think personally, I think this is an extremely useful skill to have, and I would love if my RPAs or RPs also invest time in this. I also know, for example, from another colleague at Stanford University, who's basically asking all the RAs to basically feed in everything that they have first into ChatGPT if they're basically creating like a summary doc or something like this, because he thinks it really helps the workflow. So I think basically using these tools, not only ChatGPT, but other like generative AI software for creating graphs or whatnot, pictures, I think at least in my day-to-day life, would be extremely useful. But I can't comment on like the more broader initiative there at this moment. But yeah, it's rapidly evolving. So probably in 6 months, it will be a different one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there are lots of parts of the job, that you would like to do with more attention, but there's just not enough time. Like one thing I can think of related to teaching, but it's also true in companies, right, is giving people feedback on their work. And you want to give detailed feedback, constructive suggestions for improvements. But when you have 100 students, that's very hard to do. And so I think being able to use AI tools to actually read people's drafts, give them feedback, I think there's potential to give much better instructions and much better suggestions for improvement than what faculty can do. In terms of institutional support, actually a colleague of mine in management, Brad Biddley, and I, we just got a grant to study not just how to give students feedback, but also how this changes the students' perception of the faculty, right? So it could be that AI gives much better feedback than I ever could, but people now think I'm an extremely lazy instructor, and so they don't read the feedback. Or they don't take it seriously. And so actually understanding how people respond to this AI information, I think is something we haven't spent too much time thinking about, but I think is important.
Mm-hmm. Great. One of the audience members asked that a good question, I think, to think about longer term, that if everybody's using AI to make decisions, how do you see companies maintaining a long-term sustainable advantage? What do you think they need to be investing in, spending their time on? How should they prioritize? Mark, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I mean, because these are sorts of questions people ask about this, and I think, given, as I mentioned in my little presentation at the beginning, these models, when you talk to them, they can appear very intelligent because of the information that they've baked in from how language is typically used, and so that can easily be confused with being good at thinking through problems. And so you've got to remember that these models are trained to produce plausible series of words, and so the thing that it's very highly unlikely to ever be good at, a model like this, is asking it for, say, ask ChatGPT, what should I invest in? Because what ChatGPT is likely to respond is something normal that everybody else will be saying. And that is not, if you do the same thing as everybody else, you get the same returns as everybody else, and you may as well buy an index tracker. So coming up with unusual investment opportunities, it's unlikely to be good at that. But the sorts of things it can be very good at is helping people upskill themselves. So ChatGPT, for example, is, and some of these other language models as well, they're excellent computer programs. They work really well as pair programmers. And what they can do is help you think through normal things. So if I wanted to build an algorithmic trading system, how would I do it? And it will give you the big structure. And oh, okay, interesting. How would I do that? Oh, how do I connect to an API? And it'll talk you through these things. And you could, in theory, go off and do a lot of Googling and try and work this out yourself. But having this working effectively as a buddy to suggest things, and then you give it some code and it suggests things that improve it and things like that. Those sorts of things I think are much more plausible, where it's got vast amounts of knowledge baked into it, and it can help you with knowledge and structuring and working out what you need to do. But coming up with the opportunities from the words that it says, that's not something it's likely to be good at.
I guess that, Mark, your answer kind of leads me to want to ask Maxi and David, will people who want to get better returns in investing be better off getting an MBA at either of our institutions rather than spending their time trying to game an AI system or ChatGPT? What do you think? How would you answer that? Maxi, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think there's still definitely a value in getting the MBA. I think honestly it's both. I think, of course, as technology is rapidly evolving, you need to upskill yourself in that sense and get used to these technologies. But I don't think it will throw everything else out of the window that we had so far. I think it's an addition, essentially. It makes things more, quicker, more efficient, but it doesn't replace the old knowledge, essentially.
Yeah, and with Maxi, I think as so much of interactions at work rely on interpersonal skills, ability to negotiate, all these things, and that's not going to go away with ChatGPT. In fact, some of these skills just become more important, right? If you can automate the technical part, then the social part becomes more valuable.
Another question here from the audience about, do we trust the ESG ratings given by ChatGPT? Maxi, is that one? And I think Mark or David, you guys addressed ESG.
So I didn't ask ChatGPT for any ESG ratings. And what you only did is basically we asked ChatGPT to summarize the ESG related information within the documents themselves. So at this point, we didn't ask them to benchmark it against anything else. The summaries themselves seem to be quite informative, also how investors perceive like this ESG. For example, that in the more recent years, the sentiment of the discussion on ESG seems to be more strongly correlated with the stock returns. So that's what I can say about that. I'm not sure about the ESG ratings themselves, or whether it would be also like assistant of giving any specific numbers there, but I haven't tested this yet.
Okay. We talked about the better and faster, which was the title. There's one more word that we really haven't addressed here, and I think you're all avoiding it on me. It's the richer part. And so I know the audience here in Hong Kong in particular wants to know how they can get rich, how they can make money. How should they be thinking about that? Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think facetiously, I would say that the best way at the moment to get rich from generative AI seems to be to set up a generative AI startup. There's vast funding going in this area. So if somebody's looking for an idea, then maybe that's the way to go. If you want to target this theme directly, I think the ways that this will be useful in investing are the sorts of ways we've spoken about already. The technology underpinning some of these generative models, particularly the text-based generative models, they can easily be kind of transferred. The information that they've learned can be transferred to other natural language processing tasks that are more directly related to investing. So having summarization is useful for people, but having a natural language processing model that can read through an earnest goal transcript or read through a 10K or whatever it is and convert that into some type of score that investors can then use as part of their decision making, or an algorithm can then use to build a systematic model from. That doesn't need the generative component, but it does need the understanding of language and the ability to do that. And I think the way I see things going is when ChatGPT first came out, it was the first computer we've ever built that was bad at maths, because it's trained on what humans say, and humans are pretty bad at maths. They make all kinds of intuitive heuristic errors. And so if you had asked ChatGPT in the early days a maths question, it would be likely to make the similar sorts of errors. Whereas what we're seeing there is they have plugins. So you can have ChatGPT now realize, this is a maths question. I'm going to go to a maths solver like Wolf and Alpha and solve it that way, and then put the answer into words for human. And what the generative models really do is they're very good at the natural language processing side of things, understanding text. I think it becomes an easy interface to a lot of other systems, but I think the specialized tasks are going to stay where they are, rather than being baked into the specific AI that does the generative component.
David and Maxi, do you agree with Mark that the opportunity is to create a startup if you want to get rich in this space?
That's
any other
always
suggestions? What, David?
Oh, that's always good, right? You want to be one of the first in a new area. That's a good way. I think I also agree with Mark. If you have you can make information that before that was too complex to process, right? You can somehow make that processable with a tool like ChatGPT or the technology underlying it. And so, one thing I would do is I would try to think of information that you as in a company or as an investor that you already have, but didn't really know something to do with because of its complexity, and then see how can you actually extract value from that information. And the other thing I would think, and this goes back to a bit of the interpersonal one, but imagine, if you have founded the startup, how do you pitch your idea, right? And one thing that I think ChatGPT is very useful for is brainstorming and practicing. So actually ask it to help you design a pitch for your new ChatGPT-based startup, and then practice it and say, pretend to be an investor and ask me questions. And then when you actually give the real pitch, you will be much more prepared.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks. Maxi, how about you? Any ideas?
Yeah, this seems to be pretty good advice. I don't think I have much to add there. I totally agree also what Mark said in terms of the investments, how it will change. I think more broadly, also reading and again listening to like what all these hedge fund founders are saying. Yeah, I think it will be also used somehow for processing information, like directly getting sentiment out of documents, for example, that are outperforming perhaps older models that are not trained on so much data. But yeah, I think most of the things will be really investing in your own skills and then using them, for example, founding a startup or being better in pitches to investors and something like this. Yeah.
Great. Last question, and this is probably appropriate now that you've shared how we can get rich using ChatGPT or not. And it's about government regulation and the regulatory bodies and how far behind they are typically when technology is advancing so rapidly. Do you see anything coming down the pipe in terms of government regulation and how governments can actually catch up with this space? Mark?
To be honest, I don't really have any special insight onto what's coming down the pike there. I mean, with so much focus on this area from everybody, then inevitably there will be new rules. There are also existing frameworks for managing risks, and particularly model risk is already an area with a lot of regulation. So I think it'll be interesting to see, is it something where just existing regulation needs to be clarified, or does it need a whole new regulatory framework to address the risks?
Mm-hmm. David and Maxi, any final comments regarding regulation and government involved?
I also don't have any unique insights. I just personally think it will be pretty hard for like just a single country or so to regulate this, because then you're basically shut out and the entire rest of the world will be using these tools and perhaps outperform you. I think Italy temporarily also banned OpenAI, and I think it's now usable there again. So there's definitely regulators have attention, and they are probably definitely figuring out to safeguard data or anything like this. I'm just personally skeptical, and this is my personal opinion, to what extent this will be really possible to do, like just for a given country or like also Europe as well.
Yeah, also just my personal opinion, but I think it's going to be a mess for a little while with different countries or different regions adopting different regulation. And particularly, I think the space to watch is Europe and the GDPR. So the sense of, people having control over their data, it makes it impossible to get people's consent, right? To use your data to train an AI language model. That makes no sense. And so if there's not some exemption carved out for this, I think that'd be a huge competitive disadvantage.
Great. Well, thank you. Maxi, will you continue on with your research? And if we have students or audience members who want to follow what you're doing at the Booth School, how can they follow you? And where's your research taking you?
Yeah, so we are working on multiple projects currently. We're also perhaps making a website for it, so we're still working on this. I think if you have any questions or want to discuss anything, we just send me an email. I think my email is on my webpage, the Booth webpage. I'm happy to give answers. If you have ideas as well, related topics, yeah. But yeah, the Booth website essentially.
That's great. That's great. Mark, David, and Maxi, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight. I learned a lot. I hope that the audience learned a lot as well, with regard to this particular topic. And maybe we'll have you back in another 6 months and we can update, because this is such a fast moving space. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We do have the brief poll tonight for this particular program on Zoom. And if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube Live, you can leave your answer in the comments below. And while you complete the survey, let me just tell you a little bit more about a program that we have next week. It's another director's pick, something that was fascinating to me. We'll have our first billionaire join us on the UN campus here in Hong Kong on an online program called Billionaire Secrets, Bias in the Luxury Real Estate Market. That'll be July 13th at 8:30 p.m. So I hope you can join us for that. And then also make sure that you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, all the social media sites. even on WeChat in China, and also our UN campus website. And I just wanted to mention finally that don't forget to listen to the course podcast. It's a special production podcast here of the University of Chicago UN campus right here in Hong Kong. You can learn more about our UChicago faculty. Maxi tonight told me he's committing to join the podcast, so you can learn more about how he became a professor. The podcast focuses on how our UChicago professors became professors and talks a little bit about their research as well. So I hope you can listen to the course podcast on Apple, Spotify, Himalaya, and China, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Good night. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.